He once mocked Keanu Reeves in a cruel article that nearly destroyed his career. 20 years later, the same journalist shows up trembling, begging for forgiveness. But instead of anger, Keanu offers him words that stop him, cold words the world would never forget. What did Keanu say that made his mocker break down in tears? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The year was 2003. The world was obsessed with Hollywood blockbusters, gossip magazines, and internet forums that could make or break a career overnight. Inside a small, dimly lit newsroom in downtown Los Angeles, a 30-year-old journalist named David Hensley hunched over his desk. His fingers raced across the keyboard, his coffee gone cold beside him. His eyes glimmered with ambition, the kind that burned too fast and too bright. David worked for The Star Scene, a popular entertainment magazine known for its biting reviews and scandalous headlines. His editor, a gruff man named Mark Doyle, hovered nearby. "Make it sharp, make it sting," Mark said, tapping his pen against David's desk. "The readers love controversy. Give them something to talk about." David smirked. He knew exactly what Mark wanted. His latest target was Keanu Reeves, the rising action star whose fame had skyrocketed with The Matrix. The sequel was about to release, and public attention was massive. But the critics were divided. Some adored Keanu's quiet intensity, while others mocked his simplicity. David saw an opportunity to ride the wave of cynicism. He leaned back in his chair, reading aloud the opening line of his article. "Keanu Reeves," he said, smirking, "is Hollywood's most emotionless leading man, a man with one facial expression and no emotional range." His coworker laughed from the next cubicle. That laughter was all the encouragement he needed. Within hours, David finished the piece, a 3-page takedown filled with sarcasm and disdain. He compared Keanu's performance to a cardboard cutout with better posture. He accused him of being a product of good lighting and luck. Every sentence dripped with arrogance, written not from truth, but from hunger for attention. When he handed the article to Mark, the editor grinned. "You've got fire, Hensley. This'll go viral before the weekend." David felt a rush of pride as he imagined his byline splashed across every newsstand in Los Angeles. That night, he went home feeling like he'd just made his mark in Hollywood journalism. 2 days later, the article hit the shelves and the internet exploded. Blogs picked it up, TV anchors quoted it, and late-night hosts joked about it on air. David watched it all unfold from his small apartment, sipping beer and laughing at his own cleverness. For a moment, he believed he had arrived. But somewhere else, far from that newsroom, another man held that same article in silence. Keanu Reeves sat inside a movie trailer parked at Fox Studios, reading every cruel word. The world outside buzzed with cameras and chatter, but inside, the room felt frozen. His assistant, Maria, peeked through the curtain and noticed the magazine in his hands. "Keanu, maybe don't," she began, but stopped when she saw his face. He wasn't angry, just still. He folded the paper neatly, placed it on the table, and whispered, "Let's get ready for the next scene." Maria hesitated. "Are you okay?" Keanu gave a small nod. "It's just words. They don't define me." But deep down, they had already left a mark. The day moved on, as if nothing had happened. Outside the trailer, the film set buzzed with crew members adjusting lights, choreographers rehearsing stunts, and cameras humming under the California Sunday. Keanu stepped out in costume, his expression calm as ever. No one could tell that. Only an hour earlier, he had read one of the harshest attacks on his character and talent. When the director called action, Keanu dove into his role with quiet precision. He moved like a man who lived between two worlds, focused, disciplined, unreachable. Every line, every step, carried a quiet intensity that only those closest to him could truly understand. He had learned long ago that the best way to respond to cruelty was with silence and consistency. Between takes, Maria brought him a cup of tea. She didn't mention the article again, but she didn't have to. It lingered in the air like static. He could see the discomfort in her eyes, and even some of the crew members seemed hesitant around him that day. The entertainment world was small gossip traveled fast. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Keanu sat alone outside the trailer, watching the orange glow fade behind the studio lot. He took out the magazine again, reading the headline once more. Keanu Reeves, the wooden hero of Hollywood. The words were bold, almost mocking. But instead of tearing the paper apart, he folded it again and placed it into his bag. He wasn't collecting it as a wound, but as a reminder of how words could shape perception and how dangerous judgment could be when fueled by ego. Meanwhile, across town, David Hensley basked in the glow of his sudden fame. Radio hosts invited him to talk shows. Online forums debated his opinion. His inbox overflowed with offers from other outlets. Some readers praised him for being brutally honest. Others criticized him for being heartless. But David didn't care. Controversy was oxygen for a young journalist hungry to climb the ranks. In one of his interviews, a host asked, "Do you think Keanu Reeves will respond?" David laughed into the microphone. "If he ever learns to show emotion, maybe." The audience chuckled. Cameras flashed. Headlines followed. Journalist doubles down on Keanu. Criticism. The more they laughed, the more confident David became. He mistook mockery for success, forgetting that every word carried weight beyond the moment of applause. That night, while the city pulsed with neon light, Keanu returned home to his quiet apartment. He made himself a simple meal, turned on soft music, and read a book by candlelight. Outside the window, the world continued spinning with noise and gossip, but inside, there was calm. He didn't need to defend himself. The years had already taught him that time had a way of revealing the truth. He simply whispered to himself, "Do good work. Stay kind." He didn't yet know that one man's cruel article would one day become the doorway to one of the most profound acts of forgiveness in his life. Weeks passed, and the article refused to fade. It became a cultural echo, quoted and referenced every time Keanu's name appeared in a discussion about acting. The phrase "wooden actor" attached itself to him like an unwanted shadow. Talk show hosts repeated it with smirks. Magazine covers parodied it. Even fans who admired his films sometimes joked about it, unaware that those careless words had been born from one man's ambition. Keanu carried on. He continued showing up early on set, treating everyone from camera operators to janitors with the same respect. But those who worked closest to him began to notice subtle changes. He smiled less between scenes. He spent longer hours alone. When Maria tried to cheer him up, he would respond gently, "Don't worry, I'm fine." Yet in the quiet moments, his eyes betrayed something heavier, something unspoken. Meanwhile, David Hensley's rise continued. He became known as the man unafraid to say what others wouldn't. Editors loved him because he brought attention, clicks, and controversy. He was invited to celebrity panels and award show press rooms, always chasing the next headline. Yet under his confident exterior, a faint unease began to grow. He would see Keanu's calm demeanor in interviews, never defensive, never angry, and wonder why the man he had mocked refused to retaliate. One evening, a young intern in the newsroom approached David timidly. "Sir, do you ever worry your words might hurt people?" she asked. David laughed it off at first, but the question lingered. He dismissed it with bravado, saying, "That's the business. People should toughen up." But later that night, when he was alone in his apartment, that sentence echoed back at him. For the first time, he wondered if he had gone too far. Across the city, Keanu prepared for the film's premiere. As he stepped onto the red carpet, the flashes of cameras surrounded him like lightning. Reporters shouted his name. One of them asked loudly, "Keanu, what do you think about the critics who say you lack emotion?" He paused, meeting their gaze with quiet composure. "Everyone's entitled to their opinion," he said softly. "I just try to do my best." The crowd went silent for a moment. There was no bitterness in his tone, only sincerity. Then he smiled and walked on. It was a moment that said more than any headline ever could. That night, when David watched the interview replay on television, something inside him shifted. Keanu's words were not defensive, they were freeing. He didn't lash out, didn't mock back. He simply accepted it and moved on. David felt an unfamiliar sting in his chest. Not pride, but guilt. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet moment of grace would stay with him for decades. Because the words that once made him famous would one day bring him face to face with the very man he tried to tear down and lead him to the hardest apology of his life. Time became the quietest teacher. The years rolled forward, and the sting of that cruel article faded from the public eye, but not from the lives it had touched. Keanu Reeves moved through the changing tides of fame with the same calm grace he'd always shown. One film after another proved his resilience. Constantine, The Lake House, John Wick. Yet even with his success, he never chased the noise. When other stars filled their lives with headlines, Keanu filled his with silence, charity, and the kind of presence that didn't need applause. Behind every interview smile was a man who had lived through loss and loneliness. His sister's illness, his daughter's death, the accident that took the love of his life, all shaped him into someone who carried empathy like armor. He never spoke about the people who mocked him. He didn't have to. His actions did the speaking. He quietly donated millions to children's hospitals, funded cancer research, and often slipped away unnoticed after helping strangers. To the public, he became the rare kind of celebrity people, trusted, humble, grounded, and deeply human. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit newsroom in Portland, Oregon, David Hensley sat at a creaky desk littered with yellowed papers and half-empty coffee cups. 2 decades had passed since his famous article, and he was no longer the sharp-tongued critic he once was. His hair had thinned, his face carried the weight of too many sleepless nights, and his voice lacked the arrogance it once had. The internet had killed the world he knew. Tabloids fell. Gossip columns turned into clickbait blogs run by algorithms. And just like that, the man who once mocked Hollywood's brightest now typed obituaries and local charity blurbs for a fading community paper. Every few months, someone would recognize his name and ask, "Hey, aren't you the guy who wrote that old Keanu Reeves article?" David would force a smile and shrug. Yeah, a lifetime ago. Inside, it burned. He often wondered where Keanu was now. He saw his face on billboards and movie posters. But what struck him most wasn't the fame. It was the kindness that followed his name wherever it appeared. He'd hear stories of Keanu riding the subway, eating, alone, helping strangers. None of it matched the man David had described. At night, when the office lights dimmed, David sometimes opened an old folder buried deep in his drawer. Inside was a faded copy of that article. The paper was brittle at the edges, but the headline was still readable. "The Wooden Hero of Hollywood." He stared at those words, his own words, and felt an ache rise in his chest. "Why did I do that?" he whispered to the empty room. There was no one to answer. The guilt didn't come all at once. It arrived quietly, like rain tapping against glass, soft at first, and then impossible to ignore. David tried to tell himself it was just a phase, that he had only written what everyone else was thinking back then. But deep down, he knew the truth. His article hadn't been honest journalism. It had been cruelty disguised as wit, and cruelty always left echoes. In the early 2010 seconds, David's world shrank even more. His friends and media moved on to podcasts and television, while he stayed behind, clinging to what little stability he had left. The newspaper building grew quieter every year. Empty desks, old monitors, and the smell of dust filled the air. He wasn't fired, but he wasn't noticed either. Forgotten just like the gossip magazines he once helped sell. He lived alone in a small apartment downtown. The walls were bare except for a few framed clippings from his early career, trophies from a time when he thought being loud meant being brave. Now, every framed page looked like a mistake carved into glass. He rarely entertained visitors. Most evenings, he'd sit by the window, smoking, watching the city lights flicker like ghosts of conversations long gone. One cold November night, David couldn't sleep. He wandered into his living room, turned on his old laptop, and opened a browser out of habit. His homepage, a news site, played a short clip that immediately caught his attention. The caption read, Keanu Reeves gives up his subway seat for a stranger again. He clicked. The video showed grainy footage from someone's phone. Keanu, wearing a simple beanie and dark jacket, was sitting quietly on a New York subway. When a woman entered carrying a heavy bag, he immediately stood up and gestured for her to take his seat. He smiled faintly, then held onto the rail as the train moved. No cameras, no press, no staged moment, just decency. The woman thanked him, clearly recognizing who he was. Keanu nodded once, polite but modest, as if it was nothing. The clip ended there, just a few seconds long. But the silence that followed in David's apartment felt endless. He replayed it again and again. Each time, the same thought surfaced. This is the man I called Wooden. He leaned back in his chair, covering his face with trembling hands. For the first time in years, he felt tears pressing behind his eyes. Not from pity, but from shame. He had spent half his life trying to prove he was smarter than everyone else. Keanu had spent his life proving that kindness didn't need to be loud. The contrast cut deep. That night, David shut his laptop and whispered into the empty room, "You deserved better than my words." But Keanu would never hear him, or so he thought. The following days felt heavier than usual. David carried the weight of that moment like a stone in his chest. Every time he saw Keanu's face on television or in an article, the same unease returned. But now, it wasn't irritation or cynicism. It was remorse. The man he once ridiculed had become a symbol of grace, humility, and quiet strength. Over the years, more stories surfaced. Videos of Keanu donating to children's hospitals anonymously. Accounts of him stopping to help a stranded driver on the highway. Stories of him befriending janitors, buying breakfast for movie crews, and sitting beside the homeless without cameras rolling. It was as if the universe had decided to hold up a mirror, forcing David to see how wrong he had been. He started clipping these stories, not for work, but for something deeper. In a drawer beside his desk, he kept a folder labeled Reeves. Inside it were pages torn from magazines, screenshots from articles, and printed photos. He never told anyone about it. It wasn't a shrine, it was a confession in paper form. Every act of kindness he read about felt like another reason to apologize. His co-workers noticed the change. The man who once scoffed at sentiment now wrote small, human stories about local heroes, firefighters, and volunteers. He no longer chased scandal. He sought redemption in every paragraph. His editor once joked, "You're getting soft, Hensley." David only smiled faintly and replied, "Maybe soft isn't such a bad thing." One rainy evening, as he packed up his things, he noticed an article trending online, "Why the World Loves Keanu Reeves." The headline made him pause. He clicked it and began to read. The writer described Keanu not as a movie star, but as a man who carries grief with grace and kindness without agenda. David sat in silence. Each line cut deeper than the last, not because it hurt, but because it was true. He thought back to his own article from 20 years earlier, filled with arrogance and mockery. He had painted Keanu as hollow, lifeless, undeserving of his success. Now, looking back, he realized he hadn't been describing Keanu at all. He'd been describing himself empty, proud, and desperate for validation. That night, he walked home under the drizzle, his reflection flickering in every puddle along the sidewalk. He felt smaller with every step, but somehow lighter too. When he reached his apartment, he sat at his desk and took out a blank sheet of paper. For the first time in years, his fingers trembled not from excitement, but humility. At the top of the page, he wrote one sentence, "To Keanu Reeves, I owe you an apology." He didn't know if he would ever send it, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time in decades, David wasn't writing to be seen. He was writing to heal. The winter sun hung low over Portland, pale and thin through the hospital window. David sat on the examination table, his breath shallow, his palms clammy against the paper gown. The doctor, A kind-faced woman in her 50s looked over his test results in silence. When she finally spoke, her tone was gentle but firm. "David, your heart isn't working as well as it should. It's not critical yet, but it's something you need to take seriously." He tried to laugh it off. "So what are you saying? I should drink more green juice?" She smiled faintly. "I'm saying you need to slow down. Your stress levels are high. You've been carrying something heavy for too long. Find peace where you can. Find closure if you need to." The word closure lingered. It echoed louder than the ticking clock on the wall. When he got home that evening, he collapsed into his worn-out armchair and stared at the ceiling. The apartment felt quieter than usual. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car outside, and the steady thump of his heart, a reminder that time was running out. He stood and walked toward his old filing cabinet, the one he hadn't opened in years. The drawers squeaked as he pulled one open. Inside were stacks of folders, drafts, and newspaper clippings, remnants of a career that had burned bright and faded just as fast. His fingers brushed across old headlines until they stopped on one that made him freeze. It was the original copy of the Keanu Reeves article. The paper was yellowed, edges curled from time, but the headline was still sharp. "The Wooden Hero of Hollywood." He sat at his desk and unfolded it slowly. Every cruel word jumped off the page, raw and painful even after all these years. His chest tightened. He had written it in arrogance, but now, with age and frailty softening him, he saw it for what it truly was, a wound he had never healed. He read the article from start to finish, his heart aching with each line. By the end, his hands were trembling. He pressed the paper flat against the table and whispered, "I can't leave this undone." For a long moment, he sat in silence. Then he reached for a blank sheet of stationery and his favorite old pen. The same pen he used to sign his first big contract, the one he thought would make him immortal. He began to write, "Dear Mr. Reeves, you don't know me, but you might remember what I once wrote about you. I called you names that no man deserved. I mocked your talent and your kindness. Those words have haunted me for over 20 years. He paused, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. The words came slowly, but honestly this time. For once, David wasn't writing to impress anyone. He was writing to make things right. The pen scratched softly against the paper as David continued to write. He poured his heart into every line, each word peeling away years of guilt. "I told the world you were emotionless, but I see now. That said more about me than about you. I've watched you for years, not as a critic, but as a man trying to understand what grace looks like. I saw you give your subway seat to a stranger. I saw you laugh with fans who never expected you to stop and talk. You taught me something I never learned in all my years chasing headlines, that kindness is louder than ego." He paused, wiped his eyes, and took a deep breath before continuing. "If I hurt you, I'm sorry. Truly. You didn't deserve those words, or the shadow they cast. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I regret it more than anything I've ever written." When he finally stopped, the letter spanned 3 pages. His hand shook from exhaustion, but his heart felt strangely lighter. He folded the pages carefully, slid them into an envelope, and wrote Keanu Reeves's name on the front in neat, deliberate handwriting. The next morning, he sat in his car outside the post office for nearly 20 minutes before finding the courage to go inside. He felt foolish at first, a washed-up journalist mailing an apology to a Hollywood legend. But something deep inside urged him on. When he finally dropped the envelope into the slot, a quiet relief swept through him. He whispered, "It's done." Days passed, and life resumed its quiet rhythm. He didn't expect a reply, didn't even check his email for a while. The letter wasn't about hearing back, it was about setting his spirit free. But as fate often does, it had other plans. 2 weeks later, while sorting through junk mail at his desk, he noticed a new email in his inbox. The sender's name froze him in place. Assistant to Mr. Keanu Reeves. His heartbeat quickened. For a moment, he thought it was a scam or a cruel prank. His hand hovered over the mouse before he finally clicked it open. The message was short, simple, and devastatingly kind. Mr. Hensley, Mr. Reeves read your letter and wanted me to thank you personally. He appreciates your honesty and your courage. He will be in Los Angeles next week and wondered if you might like to meet for coffee. Please let us know what day works best for you. David reread the email again and again, barely breathing. He leaned back in his chair, his pulse racing. He could hardly process what he was seeing. After 22 years, the man he had wounded most deeply was offering him peace, not through lawyers or publicists, but over a simple cup of coffee. For the first time in decades, David didn't feel cursed by his past. He felt invited to face it. The next few days felt unreal. David moved through them in a haze, torn between disbelief and panic. He reread the email every morning as if it might vanish, like a dream too fragile to hold on to. The words seemed impossible. He appreciates your honesty. He'd like to meet for coffee. He barely slept that week. Every time he closed his eyes, memories replayed the smug grin of his younger self typing cruel sentences, the sound of his editor's laughter, the flashes of fame that followed. They felt distant now, like a movie he no longer recognized himself in. He had lived so long with regret that forgiveness seemed like fiction. Yet here it was, waiting in his inbox, asking for nothing but honesty in return. He finally replied, his hands trembling as he typed, "Yes, I would be honored to meet. Any time, any place." He hesitated before pressing send, whispering, "Thank you, God," under his breath. The morning of the meeting, he sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at his reflection in the dark window. He looked old. His skin was pale, his eyes lined, but his heart felt strangely alive. He poured himself a cup of coffee he couldn't drink and rehearsed what he might say. Every version of his apology felt inadequate. What words could undo 2 decades of damage? When the day finally came, David boarded a flight to Los Angeles. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as he stared out the window, lost in thought. He had spent his entire career dissecting other people's lives, but now, for the first time, his own story was being rewritten, and he had no control over how it would end. Landing in Los Angeles brought a flood of memories. The city hadn't changed much. The same palm trees swaying in the wind, the same golden light stretching across the horizon. But David wasn't the same man who had once strutted through this place, chasing gossip and applause. Now he walked slowly, humbly, clutching a folded copy of the letter he'd written just in case Keanu hadn't received it. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the muffled laughter from the street below. He wondered if Keanu would actually show up, or if his assistant had extended the offer out of politeness. Still, a small part of him dared to hope. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the curtains, David's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Keanu's assistant. "Mr. Reeves will meet you tomorrow morning at Cafe Modena, 10 a.m. He read it 3 times, his throat tightening. After 22 years, it was really happening. He set the phone down, covered his face with both hands, and let out a shaky breath. This was no longer about journalism, reputation, or even forgiveness. It was about finally standing before the man he had wronged and seeing who they both had become. The morning sun broke over Los Angeles, spilling golden light across the glass buildings and palm-lined streets. Inside a small cafe tucked between 2 art galleries, David Hensley sat at a corner table near the window, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He arrived early, nearly 40 minutes before the agreed time, because the idea of being late terrified him. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries. People came and went, their conversations a blur of laughter and motion. For David, every sound was magnified: the hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of cups, the faint hum of music in the background. It all mixed into a kind of anxious symphony that made his pulse race even faster. He tried to calm himself by reading the small menu in front of him, but his eyes couldn't focus. He ordered a black coffee and barely touched it. His fingers trembled as he checked his watch again and again. 10 minutes had passed, then 15, Each second felt longer than the last. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded copy of his letter, the same one he had sent weeks ago. The paper was creased, worn at the edges. He had read it so many times that he could recite every line by heart. Still, he kept unfolding and refolding it, as if somehow it might prepare him for what was coming. He whispered to himself, rehearsing lines under his breath. "Keanu, I'm sorry for what I wrote. It was cruel and thoughtless. I don't deserve your forgiveness." He paused, then frowned. No, too formal. Maybe just, "I was wrong." The words all sounded wrong. He had spent his life mastering language, but in this moment, every sentence felt clumsy and hollow. What could he possibly say to erase 2 decades of regret? He looked out the window. The city was alive people, walking dogs, buses roaring past, sunlight glinting off car windshields. He wondered how many times Keanu had walked unnoticed among these same streets, just another face in a world too busy to see kindness. His reflection in the window startled him. The man staring back looked old and tired. His once thick hair was now streaked with gray. Deep lines carved across his face like old rivers of worry. He barely recognized himself. He took a slow breath, his chest tightening. "This is it," he murmured. "You wanted closure. Now face it." He didn't notice the time slipping away until the bell over the door jingled softly. The cafe grew quieter for a split second, and when David looked up, he froze. Standing in the doorway was Keanu Reeves. No entourage, no publicist, no bodyguard. Just Keanu, calm, collected, and wearing a simple black jacket over a gray shirt. His presence filled the room, not because of fame, but because of something deeper, something still and grounding. For a moment, the air seemed to still. Conversations faded into the background as Keanu stepped inside, his movements quiet and unhurried. He looked around briefly, scanning the cafe, until his eyes met David's. That calm, steady gaze carried no trace of hostility, just quiet recognition. David's breath caught in his throat. His instinct was to stand, but his legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the floor. When Keanu approached, David finally rose, fumbling awkwardly with his jacket. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu smiled gently, his voice low and warm. "Keanu's fine. Please, sit." The humility in that simple reply disarmed David completely. Every line of his carefully rehearsed apology vanished from his mind. He sank back into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. Keanu sat across from him, resting his elbows loosely on the table. His eyes were kind, patient, but unreadable. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just charged with memory, regret, and something David couldn't quite name. Finally, Keanu nodded toward the untouched coffee on the table. "You've been here a while?" David tried to smile, but it came out nervous. "Yeah, I didn't want to risk being late." Keanu nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "You came all the way from Portland, right?" "Yes," David said softly. I didn't think you'd remember that." "I remember more than people think," Keanu replied. There was no pride in his tone, only quiet truth. A waiter passed by, and Keanu ordered a cappuccino, his voice polite but subdued. Once the waiter left, the silence returned. David fidgeted with the paper sleeve of his cup, tearing it into small strips without realizing. His heart raced, but he forced himself to speak. "I don't know how to start," he said finally. "I've imagined this moment for years. I've written and rewritten what I wanted to say 100 times. But now that you're sitting here, every word sounds small." Keanu leaned back slightly, listening intently. There was no judgment in his expression, only attention, the kind of presence that made David feel seen, not condemned. "You don't have to say everything perfectly," Keanu said quietly. "Sometimes just showing up is enough." That simple kindness hit David like a wave. He blinked hard, his throat tightening. "I've hurt a lot of people in my life," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But what I did to you, it followed me. Every time I saw your face on a screen, I thought about it. I thought about how my words could have hurt someone who didn't deserve it." Keanu's eyes softened. "We all make mistakes," he said. "It's what we do after that matters." David nodded, struggling to hold himself together. "I didn't come here for forgiveness," he whispered. "I came here because I didn't want to leave this world with that on my conscience." Keanu's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Then I'm glad you came." The waiter placed Keanu's cappuccino on the table, the steam rising gently between them. The smell of roasted coffee filled the small space, warm and grounding. Keanu took a slow sip before setting the cup down, never taking his eyes off David. "So," Keanu said softly, "you wanted to talk?" David nodded, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I do. I owe you something that's long overdue." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. 22 years ago, I wrote something cruel. Not just critical cruel. I didn't know you. I didn't understand you. I was young and proud, and I thought that tearing someone down would make me look clever. It didn't. It just made me empty." Keanu didn't interrupt. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of deep compassion that made it harder for David to go on. "I told myself it was just an article," David continued. "Just words. But those words haunted me. I saw how the world started calling you the wooden actor, and I knew I had helped plant that seed. I've lived with that guilt for half my life." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it to your face. I'm sorry, Keanu." The cafe had gone strangely quiet. The sounds of espresso machines and conversation seemed to fade into the distance. For a long moment, Keanu didn't speak. He just looked at David, really looked at him, as if searching for the truth behind his words. Then he gave a small nod. "I read that article," Keanu said calmly. "Back then, it hurt. Not because of what you wrote, but because I didn't understand why someone would write something so harsh about a stranger." He paused, taking another sip of his coffee. "But time changes things. You grow, you learn. I learned that holding on to pain only makes it heavier." David's eyes glistened. "You're a better man than I'll ever be." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No, I just learned to let things go. We all change. What matters is today." The words hit David with quiet force. Simple, but profound. He felt his throat tighten as he nodded slowly, unable to speak. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "You came here because you wanted peace, right?" "Yes," David whispered. "Then you have it," Keanu said, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't need to carry this anymore." For a moment, David couldn't breathe. Then, without meaning to, he laughed softly through his tears. The relief that washed over him was indescribable, a release that felt almost sacred. Keanu stood, extending his hand. David rose to meet it, his palm trembling as their hands clasped. "Thank you for coming." "It takes courage to face the past." David's voice cracked as he replied, "No, thank you for letting me." As Keanu turned to leave, the bell over the cafe door chimed again. David watched him step into the sunlight, his heart lighter than it had been in decades. After Keanu sat back down, something subtle shifted in the air. The tension that had been pressing between them softened, as if the weight of 2 decades had finally been acknowledged. David expected silence to stretch awkwardly, but instead, Keanu spoke first, his voice calm, almost curious. "So," Keanu said gently, "how have you been all these years?" David blinked, confused. "You're asking me?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Of course. We're here, aren't we?" David hesitated. I don't really know how to answer that." He gave a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been working for a small local paper in Portland. Nothing big, just human interest stuff now. Charities, community events, the kind of stories no one clicks on anymore." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "Those sound like the right kind of stories." David tilted his head, unsure how to respond. "Most people wouldn't say that." "I would," Keanu replied softly. The world needs stories about kindness more than it needs noise. That single line hit David harder than he expected. He felt a lump form in his throat. For years, he had told himself his career had meaning because it reached millions, even if it hurt people. But hearing Keanu say it so plainly without judgment made him realize how much truth he'd been avoiding. He managed a quiet, "I wasn't expecting this kindness." Keanu smiled, his eyes gentle. Kindness doesn't need a reason. Those words hung between them, still and powerful. David swallowed hard, trying to hold himself steady. He had imagined this meeting 100 different ways. Hostile, uncomfortable, maybe even distant, but never like this. Never with such grace. The conversation began to flow more naturally after that. They talked about ordinary things. The city, the weather, how Los Angeles still carried that strange mix of glamour and loneliness. Keanu spoke slowly, never rushing his words, and when he asked questions, he actually listened. It disarmed David completely. "So you stayed in Portland all this time?" Keanu asked. "Yes," David said. "I thought about moving back here, but the noise didn't feel right anymore." Keanu nodded in understanding. Silence can be a good teacher. David smiled faintly. "You always talk like someone who's figured life out." Keanu chuckled softly. "I haven't. I just try to pay attention." The simplicity of that answer silenced David for a moment. All his life he had equated wisdom with fame, knowledge with success. Yet here was a man who had both and carried them like they weighed nothing at all. David glanced down at his trembling hands and exhaled. He couldn't hold it in any longer. "Keanu," he said quietly, "there's something I need to say before I lose the courage to say it." Keanu set his cup down and looked at him patiently. "Go ahead." David took a deep breath. "I wrote something terrible about you." David's voice cracked as he said the words. "It was cruel," he whispered, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I wasn't thinking about the damage I could cause. I just wanted to be noticed. I thought being bold made me brave, but I was just careless." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't shift or look away. He just listened, his gaze steady and calm in a way that made David's confession both harder and easier at the same time. "I've carried that shame for years," David continued. "Every time I saw your name, every time I read about you helping someone, I thought of that article. I thought of how wrong I was. I've apologized to people before, but not like this. This one haunted me." He stopped, his breathing uneven. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his temples. "You didn't deserve it. I didn't even know you. I don't know. I guess I saw someone kind and mistook kindness for weakness." Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes soft but filled with understanding. "We all make mistakes," he said quietly. "What matters is who we are now." Those words landed like sunlight, breaking through clouds. David's throat tightened, his vision blurring slightly. He had imagined judgment, maybe even anger. But not this. Not compassion. He took a shaky breath. "You're not angry?" Keanu leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "No, anger doesn't heal anything. It only repeats the same pain." David's lip trembled. "I ruined part of your life's narrative. People still quote that article sometimes. I see it online. I can't take it back." Keanu smiled gently. "You don't have to. The past already did what it was supposed to do. It taught us something. Maybe it taught you to see differently. Maybe it taught me patience. Either way, we both learned." David wiped his eyes, embarrassed by the tears he couldn't control. "You have no idea what this means to me." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "You'd be surprised. I've had people hurt me before. But I've also learned that forgiveness isn't something I give to them. It's something I give to myself." David exhaled slowly, the tension in his body beginning to release. "How do you do that? How do you just let things go?" Keanu smiled faintly. "It's not easy. You don't forget. You just stop feeding the pain. Eventually it gets tired of knocking." The line was so simple, so perfectly said, that David let out a quiet laugh through his tears. "You really should have been a philosopher." Keanu grinned. "Philosophers don't ride motorcycles." For the first time that morning, David laughed freely. The sound surprised him. It had been years since laughter came without bitterness. Keanu's warmth was effortless. It wasn't forced or polished. It was real. The kind of warmth that could only come from someone who had known loss and still chosen to be kind. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that only happens when words have done their job. Keanu stirred his coffee slowly, then looked up again, his eyes carrying that same steady calm. "You know," Keanu said softly, "I never really took those things personally. Critics, headlines, all that noise, it comes and goes. What stays are the moments that make us who we are." David nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "I wish I had understood that sooner," he said. "I thought I needed to be clever, to stand out, but all I did was hurt people who didn't deserve it. I think maybe I was jealous of people like you." Keanu raised an eyebrow slightly, not in judgment, but curiosity. "Jealous?" David gave a faint, embarrassed smile. "You were real. You didn't need to prove anything. You didn't play the game, and somehow people loved you more for it. I used to tell myself I didn't care about things like that, but deep down, I did. I cared too much about being seen, and not enough about being right." Keanu leaned forward a little, resting his elbows on the table. "That's a hard thing to admit," he said. "But it's also the beginning of something new. You can't change the past, but you can change how it lives inside you." David felt something lift inside him, something that had been locked away for years. "That's what I'm trying to do," he said quietly. "I just never thought I'd get the chance to tell you face to face. I thought people like you lived behind glass untouchable." Keanu chuckled softly. "Glass breaks easily. I'm just a person, David. We all stumble. We all learn. The difference is whether we let those stumbles define us." David looked down at the table, blinking hard to keep from crying again. "I wish I could go back and rewrite that story." Keanu's expression softened even more. "Maybe you just did," he said gently. "Not on paper, but right here." The words hit David so deeply that he couldn't respond. His throat tightened. He reached for his coffee cup just to have something to hold on to. Keanu smiled again, a faint, knowing curve of his lips. "You know, people remember harsh words, but they remember courage too. Today took courage." David looked up at him, tears now freely running down his face. "You're everything I said you weren't," he whispered. "You're real. You feel everything." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe that's what we're all supposed to do," he said quietly. "Feel everything and still choose to be kind." David nodded, unable to speak. Something inside him had shifted forever. The noise of the cafe returned, the hum of voices, the hiss of milk steaming, but for David, time had stopped. Across the table sat the man he once mocked, offering him something far greater than forgiveness: peace. As David sat there across from Keanu, a strange wave of memory rose inside him, unbidden and unstoppable. It was as if every arrogant moment of his youth was playing out behind his eyes, reminding him of who he used to be. He remembered the newsroom 2 decades earlier, the smell of cheap coffee, the clicking of typewriters, the sound of laughter when someone landed a scandalous headline. Back then, he had been the loudest among them. He wore his sarcasm like armor, mistaking cruelty for cleverness. Every jab he wrote earned him applause, and every applause made him believe he mattered. He could still see himself standing by his editor's desk, holding the printed article about Keanu with a grin that bordered on smugness. His editor had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "This one's gonna make waves, Hensley. You've got guts." David had laughed. He had felt invincible. Now, sitting in that cafe, the memory made him sick. He could still hear the echoes of those old laughs, and they sounded hollow. Every cruel word he'd written seemed to bounce back through time, aimed now at the man he had become. He looked across the table at Keanu, who sat quietly, sipping his coffee. His calm presence contrasting everything David remembered about himself. Keanu wasn't trying to impress or correct him. He wasn't angry. He simply was anchored, present, still. That stillness was more powerful than any speech could have been. It stripped away the defenses David had carried for years. The arrogance, the pride, the excuses, all of it fell away in the quiet weight of Keanu's silence. "Do you ever think about the past?" David asked softly. Keanu nodded once. "Sometimes, but not to relive it, to understand it." David nodded, his voice shaking. "When I think about mine, I mostly just want to erase it." Keanu set his cup down gently. "Erasing doesn't help," he said. "We need those mistakes to know who we are now." The simplicity of that answer made David's throat tighten. He wanted to believe it, but part of him still struggled to forgive himself. The images of his past swirled in his mind. The sneer on his younger face, the pride in his voice as he defended his cruelty on television, the shallow satisfaction of seeing his words spread across the world. And now, here he was, face to face with the man he had tried to humiliate, the same man who had every right to resent him, and instead was offering understanding. David lowered his head, his voice cracking. "You're a better man than I ever was." Keanu shook his head. "No," he said gently. "We just learned different lessons at different times." David's eyes stung. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a writer, or a critic, or even a man trying to be right. He felt human again, flawed, exposed, and painfully real. The memories wouldn't stop. They came in flashes like old film reels flickering behind David's eyelids. He saw his younger self sitting in a crowded newsroom, the glow of computer, screens reflecting off his arrogant grin. He remembered that moment right after publishing the infamous article. His colleagues had crowded around, laughing, high-fiving, calling him the truth teller. He could still hear the echo of his own laughter, loud, proud, hollow. He had believed he was fearless, that his words were weapons of wit. He had mocked celebrities like they were characters on a stage, not real people with hearts that could break. He thought he was shaping culture, but all he was doing was poisoning it. He saw the moment when his editor had pushed the magazine across the desk, the printed page still warm. "You're ruthless," the man had said, almost admiringly. David had smiled and replied, "It's not personal, it's just the job." Now, sitting across from Keanu Reeves, that sentence made his stomach twist. It had been personal. Every cruel word came from insecurity, a desperate attempt to be seen, to matter in a world that rewarded cynicism. The present and the past blurred. He blinked hard, trying to steady himself. But he could almost smell the stale newsroom air, almost hear the click of his old keyboard, almost feel the rush of validation as the article went viral. He remembered checking the numbers again and again, watching his fame rise while another man's humanity was reduced to a punchline. Keanu's voice pulled him back to the present. "You're somewhere else," he said softly. David nodded, his voice trembling. "I'm just remembering who I was back then." Keanu leaned back slightly, giving him space. "What do you see when you look back?" David hesitated. "A man who thought he was clever," he said finally. "Someone who hurt people for applause. Someone who thought words didn't have consequences. I look back, and I don't even like that person." Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee before speaking. "Maybe that's a good thing," he said. "It means you're not him anymore." David looked up, his eyes glistening. "I don't know if I've changed enough to deserve that." Keanu tilted his head. "Change isn't about deserving," he said. "It's about choosing." Those words echoed in David's chest. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the doorway to it. David rubbed his temples, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought this meeting would be the hardest thing I ever did, but this is harder. Sitting here and realizing who I used to be." Keanu's tone stayed gentle, steady. That's what healing feels like sometimes. It hurts first. The truth in those words broke something open inside David. He pressed his hands together, his shoulders trembling. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of 20 years. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply nodded, the quiet compassion in his eyes saying more than any speech ever could. David's hands trembled as he lowered his head. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs he couldn't contain anymore. He had spent half his life hiding behind words, crafting clever lines to sound strong, untouchable, superior. But sitting across from Keanu now, every defense he'd ever built was gone. All that remained was a man broken open by truth. "I hurt you," he whispered. "I didn't know what kind of man you were. I just saw a headline. I turned you into something I could mock, and the world joined me." Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply leaned back in his chair, his calm presence grounding the moment. He watched David quietly, not with judgment, but with deep empathy. "I used to think that if I didn't tear people down, no one would notice me," David said, his voice shaking. "But all I did was make people smaller. It made me smaller too. Every cruel thing I wrote came from a place I didn't understand until now. I was empty." He looked up at Keanu through tear-filled eyes. "And yet you're sitting here. You came to meet me. You're not angry. You're not cruel. You're not even cold. You're just kind. Why?" Keanu set his cup down slowly, his hand steady. "Because someone once forgave me too," he said quietly. "I made mistakes, and someone chose grace instead of anger. I never forgot that feeling. It's what I try to give back." David's breath hitched. "You're telling me you forgive me?" Keanu nodded gently. "Yes, David, I forgive you." The words landed softly, but their power was immense. David felt them in every part of his being. His body trembled as the tears came harder, but they were different now, lighter, cleaner. It was as if years of guilt were finally dissolving, like dust caught in sunlight. Keanu reached across the table, his hand resting over David's trembling one. His touch was firm, steady, grounding. "You can let it go now," he said. David squeezed his hand weakly, unable to speak. He felt small, but for the first time in decades, he also felt free. The weight that had sat on his chest for 20 years finally began to lift. "Thank you," David managed to whisper. "I don't deserve it." Keanu gave a faint smile. "Maybe not. But that's what makes forgiveness beautiful. It's never about what we deserve, it's about what we need." The cafe buzzed quietly around them again, but the world felt slower, softer. David looked down at their hands, his frail and shaking, Keanu's calm and strong. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't a word. It was an act, a bridge. In that moment, he understood what Keanu meant when he said, "We all change. What matters is who we are now." David's heart steadied. For the first time in years, he felt whole. For a long time, neither of them moved. The air in the cafe felt thick with emotion, heavy yet peaceful. The noise of clinking cups and soft chatter seemed to fade away, replaced by a silence that felt almost sacred. A few people nearby began to notice what was happening. Some recognized Keanu Reeves instantly, but none of them dared to interrupt. There was something deeper unfolding here, something that didn't belong to celebrity or gossip, but to two human souls meeting in truth. David sat back in his chair, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. His face was flushed, his breathing uneven. He didn't care who was watching. For years, he had been the man with the sharp tongue, the one who mocked others for showing emotion. But now, sitting in front of the very person he had once ridiculed, he could barely hold himself together. "You have no reason to forgive me," David said finally, his voice trembling. "None at all." Keanu's gaze was calm, steady, and unshakably kind. "Forgiveness isn't about reason," he said softly. "It's about freedom for both of us." The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. They carried no judgment, only peace. David felt them echo inside him, dissolving something that had been hard and cold for too long. He nodded slowly, unable to find the right response. He wanted to say more, to apologize again, to thank Keanu for being better than he ever could be, but no words seemed big enough to hold the weight of what he felt. His throat tightened, and tears filled his eyes once more. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't rush the moment or minimize it with small talk. He simply allowed it to exist. His stillness was its own form of compassion. Across the cafe, a waitress stood frozen near the counter, her eyes glistening as she realized what she was witnessing. A couple at a nearby table stopped their conversation, their hands intertwined. No one spoke. No one even reached for their phones. They all understood instinctively that this wasn't just an ordinary meeting. It was something deeply human, a quiet act of grace in a world that rarely paused to notice such things. David pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the slow, rhythmic beat of his heart. For years, that heart had carried nothing but regret and guilt, but now something lighter had begun to take its place. It wasn't joy, exactly, it was peace. Freedom, he whispered under his breath, almost to himself. I don't even remember what that felt like. Keanu gave him a small, reassuring smile. Maybe today's a good day to remember. David laughed softly through the tears. You really do talk like a monk. Keanu chuckled quietly. Maybe I just listen more than I used to. David exhaled shakily, his tears slowing but his emotions still raw. The cafe seemed to breathe with him, a living witness to something rare and unspoken. He glanced around and saw faces turn subtly in their direction, strangers pretending to sip coffee, but clearly moved by what they were witnessing. No one whispered, no one pointed. They simply looked on in quiet awe. I spent so many years trying to build walls, David said after a pause. Walls made of pride, sarcasm, cynicism. I thought they'd protect me from regret, but all they did was lock me inside my own bitterness. Keanu nodded, his tone gentle. It's easy to get lost in that. The world celebrates pride more than humility, but humility is what keeps us real. David smiled weakly. You say that like it's easy. Keanu's expression softened. It's not. I've had to learn it the hard way too. Pain teaches you that being right isn't nearly as important as being kind. The line hit David so deeply he could barely breathe. He reached for his coffee, more for something to do with his hands than to drink it, but his grip was unsteady. I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier, he said. I wish I hadn't hurt people on my way up. I thought I was clever, but I was just cruel. Keanu's eyes softened with empathy. You learned it now, he said simply. That's what matters. David swallowed hard. You make it sound so simple. Keanu smiled faintly. The truth usually is simple. It's just not always easy to face. The silence between them deepened again, but this time it was no longer painful. It felt like space. Space for healing, space for forgiveness, space for humanity. Across the room, a barista pretended to clean a counter, but his eyes were fixed on them. Something about the scene, two men sitting quietly, one broken, one whole, seemed to touch everyone who happened to be there. A woman by the window dabbed her eyes discreetly. Another man lowered his phone mid-scroll, suddenly too aware of his own distractions. David didn't notice any of it. His focus stayed on Keanu. I don't think I'll ever forget this moment, he said quietly. Not because you forgave me, but because you listened. Keanu gave a small nod. Sometimes that's all someone needs. David tilted his head, studying him. You're not like anyone I've ever met, Keanu chuckled. I get that a lot. Then his expression grew thoughtful. But maybe that's what we're all supposed to be different. Just real. David smiled through his tears. You make it sound possible. It is, Keanu said. You just proved it. David blinked, confused. Me? You showed up, Keanu said softly. Most people never do. Those words pierced deeper than any sermon could. They weren't spoken with pride or pity, only truth. And that truth felt like redemption. David sat in silence, the weight of Keanu's words sinking into him like rain into dry soil. You showed up. It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried everything he needed to hear. After all these years of hiding from his past, of rewriting memories and running from guilt, he had finally faced it, and somehow that was enough. He looked down at his shaking hands, then back up at Keanu. You don't know what this means to me, he said softly. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "What's that?" "Peace," David whispered. "I didn't even realize how much I needed it." Keanu smiled faintly. "Peace doesn't come when life gets easier. It comes when we stop fighting ourselves." David let out a soft, trembling laugh. "You really should write a book," Keanu chuckled. "I think you'd write it better than I would." David shook his head, smiling through his tears. "I don't know. Maybe once, a long time ago. But now, I think I've said enough words in this life." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time you write something new." Those words lingered, gentle but profound. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. David knew exactly what Keanu meant. For years, his writing had been about other people. Critiques, judgments, headlines. Maybe now it could be about truth, about healing. He wiped the last of his tears, feeling lighter than he had in decades. "You've taught me more in one morning than I learned in 20 years of journalism." Keanu smiled. "I didn't teach you anything. You were ready to see it." The cafe had fallen completely silent again, as if time itself had paused to let this moment finish unbroken. Keanu took the final sip of his cappuccino, then set the cup down with quiet care. He stood, adjusting his jacket, his movements calm and unhurried. "We all change," he said. "What matters is today." David looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me how to be human again." Keanu nodded once. "You always were. You just forgot for a while." They shook hands, and this time, it wasn't a handshake between strangers. It was one between two men who had seen the worst of themselves and still chose to believe in something good. Keanu smiled once more before walking toward the door. As he stepped outside, sunlight poured through the glass, wrapping him in gold. The bell above the door chimed softly, and for a long moment, David didn't move. He sat still, his reflection trembling in the window, tears drying on his face, but a new light in his eyes. Around him, the cafe began to breathe again. People went back to their conversations, but something had changed in the room. A quiet reminder that grace still existed in a world too often ruled by noise. David took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Today matters." The morning after their meeting, David woke up to sunlight spilling across his small hotel room. For a long while, he just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the folded copy of his letter still tucked inside his suitcase. His mind replayed the conversation again and again, the kindness in Keanu's voice, the quiet forgiveness that had settled between them like soft rain. He felt different. Not renewed exactly, but clearer, lighter. For the first time in decades, his thoughts weren't tangled with bitterness or self-doubt. The guilt that had followed him like a shadow seemed to have lifted. He could finally breathe without that tightness in his chest. He walked to the small desk by the window, opened his laptop, and stared at the blank document on the screen. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. He hadn't written anything meaningful in years. Most of his recent work had been routine short community features or obituary notices, nothing that demanded honesty. But now, the words began to come without effort. He typed the title slowly, "The Day Keanu Reeves Taught Me Grace." His fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then, one deep breath later, he began to write. He didn't try to sound clever or profound. He just told the truth. He wrote about the man he had once mocked, about how his arrogance had blinded him to the humanity of others, about how he had carried that mistake for 22 years, and about how, when he finally faced the man he had hurt, he was met not with anger but with compassion. He wrote that Keanu Reeves didn't need to lecture or justify himself. His silence had spoken louder than any argument could. He described the calm in Keanu's eyes, the humility in his presence, and the simplicity of the words that changed everything. Forgiveness isn't about reason, it's about freedom. David's voice in the article was different, gentler, stripped of pride. It wasn't a confession meant to repair his career. It was a testament to what real humanity looked like. He described the moment Keanu stood to leave, sunlight catching his jacket, and how, in that single instant, he realized he had witnessed something sacred. He ended the piece with a line that felt like the truest sentence he had ever written. Keanu Reeves didn't just forgive me. He reminded me that goodness still exists and that it doesn't need applause to matter. When he was done, David sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, he felt like a writer again, not because of talent, but because of truth. He sent the article to his editor with a short message: "Publish this as is. No edits." Then he closed the laptop, took a long breath, and watched the city outside his window come alive. The world suddenly seemed softer, and so did he. The article went live the next morning. David didn't expect much, maybe a few polite comments, maybe some quiet sympathy from readers who remembered his name. But by noon, his inbox began to fill. By evening, it was flooded. The story spread across social media with a speed he hadn't seen in years. People shared it not because it was scandalous, but because it was healing. The headline, "The Day Keanu Reeves Taught Me Grace," seemed to touch something universal. It wasn't about Hollywood, or fame, or gossip. It was about forgiveness. Messages poured in from around the world. A teacher from Chicago wrote, "I read this to my class today. We cried together. This is why the world still loves Keanu Reeves." A father from Toronto said, "I've been estranged from my son for 10 years. After reading this, I called him." Another reader commented, "This article made me believe in kindness again." David sat at his desk, scrolling through the comments with tears in his eyes. Every sentence felt like a small echo of the grace he had received. He realized then that forgiveness doesn't stop with two people, it moves outward, touching everyone who witnesses it. Television hosts read excerpts on air. News anchors quoted his lines. Other journalists, some of whom had once mocked him for his fall from grace, called the article a masterclass in humility. But David didn't feel pride. What he felt was gratitude. He received one message that stayed with him more than the rest. It was from a young freelance writer who said, "Your story made me think twice about the way I write. I don't want to hurt people for attention anymore." David closed his laptop and leaned back, overwhelmed. All his life he had chased fame through clever cruelty. But the thing that finally made people listen, the thing that gave his words meaning again, was an act of honesty born from remorse. He thought of Keanu, wondering if he'd read the article. He imagined him somewhere on a film set, or maybe just riding his motorcycle along the coast, wind in his hair, content in silence. Whether he saw it or not didn't matter. Keanu didn't need to respond. He didn't need to defend or celebrate anything. His forgiveness had already done what it was meant to do. Still, in the quiet of that night, David whispered into the air, "Thank you." Days later, the story reached millions. The same internet that had once amplified his cruelty now carried his redemption. People didn't repost the article with outrage or mockery, but with admiration. They didn't see it as a celebrity story, they saw it as a human one. One of the most shared comments beneath the piece read, "Keanu doesn't need to say a word. His actions speak for him." And maybe that's what grace really is, doing the right thing quietly. David printed that comment and pinned it above his desk. Every morning after, he looked at it before writing, a reminder of what he'd learned. Forgiveness had started as a single act, a quiet moment in a small cafe. But it became something larger, something living. The ripple had spread far beyond them both. And for the first time in over 20 years, David felt proud of something he had written. Not because it made him famous, but because it made him whole. Within days, David's story spread beyond anything he had imagined. Major talk shows began discussing it. News outlets ran features not about celebrity drama, but about compassion and forgiveness. What had begun as a quiet article written from one man's heart had turned into a national conversation. The headline, "The Day Keanu Reeves Taught Me Grace," appeared everywhere on morning news programs, podcasts, and online forums. But this time, David wasn't the subject of ridicule. This time, people were listening to him for the right reasons. One morning, as David made coffee in his small apartment, he turned on the television. The host of a popular talk show was reading a passage from his article aloud, her voice soft, and reverent. Forgiveness isn't about reason, it's about freedom for both of us. What a beautiful line, she said. We've all seen stories about Keanu's kindness, but hearing it from the man who once mocked him makes it even more powerful. The audience applauded. David stood frozen, the spoon in his hand trembling. He had been on talk shows before, but always as the provocateur, the cynic who made headlines for being ruthless. Now, his words were being used to inspire hope. It felt surreal. That afternoon, his inbox exploded. He spent hours reading message after message, each one more emotional than the last. A young man wrote, "I've been holding a grudge against my brother for years. After reading your story, I called him. We talked for the first time since our mom died. Thank you." A woman from Spain shared, "I work in media, and your article reminded me that our words carry weight. I'm changing the way I write about people from now on." Even fellow journalists reached out. One said, "You gave us something rare, an example of humility in our profession. You reminded us that it's okay to grow, to change, to admit we were wrong." Each message brought tears to David's eyes. He had spent most of his career believing that the world didn't change, that people were too hardened by pride and fear to learn from mistakes. But now, he was watching that belief crumble before his eyes. It wasn't about fame anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own, reshaping not only how people saw him, but how they saw each other. Later that week, one major news outlet ran a segment titled, "When Forgiveness Goes Viral." The journalist on screen said, "In a world so divided, maybe all it takes is one act of grace to remind us of what we've lost, the ability to see each other as human." David watched it quietly, humbled beyond words. He thought about Keanu, imagining him somewhere far away, completely unaware of the noise surrounding his name again. Keanu never sought attention, and he certainly didn't need validation. That was the irony. His silence always spoke louder than any interview ever could. Over the next several days, the reaction grew even larger. Old interviews of Keanu began resurfacing, online moments where he quietly helped strangers, comforted grieving fans, or refused to speak poorly about anyone. People shared clips of him giving up his subway seat, visiting hospitals, and walking alone with small gifts for strangers. Comment sections overflowed with admiration, not for his fame, but for his humility. Someone posted a side-by-side comparison of David's old article from 2003 and his new one from this year. The contrast stunned readers. One headline had dripped with sarcasm. The other was soaked in sincerity. Underneath it, a user wrote, "Proof that people can change. This is what growth looks like." David read that comment late at night and felt tears prick his eyes. Growth. That word carried a meaning he'd never earned before. For years, he'd been known for tearing others down. Now, somehow, he had become part of a story about healing. The next morning, he received a message that stopped him cold. The subject line read, "If Keanu can forgive you, maybe I can forgive myself." He opened it slowly. The email came from a man in his 50s who admitted to living with deep regret. Years earlier, he had estranged his daughter after a bitter argument. "I've carried that shame for 15 years, the man wrote. "Your story made me pick up the phone tonight. I told her I'm sorry. We cried for an hour. Thank you for helping me take that first step." David had to stop reading for a moment. He pressed his hand to his chest, overwhelmed. That single line, "Maybe I can forgive myself," struck him harder than anything else. He realized that his apology to Keanu wasn't just personal anymore. It had become a mirror for people everywhere who were ready to face their own mistakes. Later that afternoon, a former colleague reached out to a woman he had once insulted in print for leaving the industry. Her message read simply, "I saw your article. You've changed, David. I'm proud of you." He sat at his desk staring at the screen for a long time, his heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "Change," he murmured to himself. "I guess that's what this was all for." That evening, a local news crew called to ask for an interview. They wanted to film a short piece about the ripple effect of his article. David declined politely. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about what Keanu did. I just told the story." As the days passed, the storm of attention began to settle, but its effect lingered. People continued to share his words weeks later. not as clickbait, but as a reminder of something pure. In one small cafe in Los Angeles, the same one where everything had begun, a young barista taped a printed copy of the article to the wall beside the counter. Beneath it, she wrote a single line in pen: "Kindness changes everything." Keanu never commented. He never reposted the story, never mentioned it in interviews, and never reached out again. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. His actions had already spoken louder than anything else ever could. David looked at the world around him and understood something profound. His apology had started with one man, but the forgiveness that came from it belonged to everyone. 3 quiet weeks passed after the article's whirlwind of attention. The noise faded, the interviews stopped, and the world, as it always does, moved on to its next story. But David didn't mind. He had found a kind of stillness that fame could never give him. His days became slow and gentle morning walks, simple meals, soft music, and quiet gratitude. One morning, as he sorted through his mail, he noticed a cream-colored envelope among the bills and flyers. It had no return address, only his name written in elegant, familiar handwriting. The pen strokes were neat but human, careful, deliberate. His heart started to pound. He sat down at his kitchen table and opened it carefully, almost reverently. Inside was a handwritten note on thick stationery. The signature at the bottom stopped him cold. It was Keanu Reeves. He read the words once, then again, his eyes misting over before he reached the end. "David, thank you for reaching out. We all have chapters we wish we could rewrite. But what makes life beautiful is that we can still change the ending. Take care of yourself, Keanu." For a long moment, David just sat there, holding the letter against his chest. It was short, but it said everything that needed to be said. He could feel the weight of the words gentle, wise, and true. Then he noticed something else inside the envelope. A single movie ticket. He turned it over in his trembling hands. It was for the premiere of Keanu's upcoming film, scheduled for the following week in downtown Los Angeles. A soft smile crept across David's face. It wasn't an invitation for publicity or attention. It was a quiet gesture, a symbol of closure. Keanu didn't owe him anything, but he had offered something. Anyway, a bridge between past and present. The following Thursday evening, David dressed simply: a dark blazer, an old tie he hadn't worn in years, and polished shoes that still carried faint scuffs from his days covering red carpets. He didn't tell anyone he was going. It felt too personal, too sacred. The theater buzzed with flashing cameras and whispered excitement. Actors, journalists, and fans filled the red carpet, calling out Keanu's name as he arrived. David stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed and perfectly content to stay that way. He waited until everyone had gone inside, then slipped quietly into the theater. His seat was near the back, away from the cameras and bright lights. As the house lights dimmed, he felt an unexpected lump in his throat. It had been years since he'd attended a movie premiere. This time, it wasn't for a headline, it was for something deeper. The movie began. David watched in silence, moved not only by the story on screen, but by the simple fact that he was there, sharing a space with the man he had once wronged. Every scene, every frame, carried a quiet strength that reminded him of the person behind the performance, the same calm, humble spirit he'd met in that cafe. When the credits began to roll, he leaned forward, eyes glistening, unaware of what was coming next. As the final scene faded into darkness, the theater filled with the soft murmur of applause. The lights dimmed even further, and the first names began to appear on the screen. David clapped quietly, his hands trembling slightly. Then, midway through the credits, something appeared that made him freeze. It was a dedication. White letters glowed softly against a black background, simple and unadorned. For those brave enough to say sorry, and those kind enough to forgive. The words hung there for several seconds, and David felt his heart tighten. The applause grew louder around him, but he barely heard it. His chest ached with emotion. It wasn't vanity that moved him. It was grace. Somewhere in those few words he felt seen. Not as the journalist who had mocked Keanu years ago, but as the man who had tried to make things right. Tears filled his eyes, spilling down his cheeks before he could stop them. He lowered his head, wiping them away quickly, but it didn't matter. In the darkened theater, no one was looking at him. They were looking at the screen, celebrating the film. Only David knew that the line glowing there was more than a dedication. It was a message between two souls who had met at the edge of forgiveness. As the credits ended and people began to rise, David stayed seated for a while. He watched the screen fade to black, breathing slowly, letting the moment settle into him. For years, he had believed his legacy was built on his sharpness, his ability to cut with words. But now, he realized his true legacy was this: the courage to apologize and the blessing of being forgiven. When he finally stood, the crowd was already moving toward the exits. He walked slowly, his ticket still folded in his pocket, his mind quiet and full. The night air outside was cool, crisp, and strangely comforting. Cameras flashed in the distance, but he turned away from them, choosing instead to walk down a side street where the world was calm and unhurried. He reached a small park near the theater and sat on a bench under a flickering street lamp. From where he sat, he could hear faint laughter from nearby restaurants and the hum of cars passing by. He pulled the letter from his pocket and unfolded it again, tracing Keanu's words with his finger. We all have chapters we wish we could rewrite. But what makes life beautiful is that we can still change the ending. David whispered the line aloud, as if testing its truth. It felt different now, bigger, deeper. He looked up at the stars, barely visible above the city haze, and felt something inside him settle for good. His story wasn't about failure anymore. It was about transformation. He sat there for a long while, smiling quietly to himself. Somewhere across town, Keanu was probably surrounded by people, shaking hands, posing for photos. But David didn't need to see him again. The message had already been received. Forgiveness had done what fame never could. It had given him peace. Winter came quietly that year. The days grew shorter, and the light through David's apartment window turned pale and thin. His health had begun to slip again, slowly at first, shortness of breath, dizzy spells, long nights of sleepless coughing. His doctor urged him to rest, but rest no longer helped. The heart that had carried so much regret for so many years was growing weaker. After several fainting episodes, David was admitted to a small hospital just outside Portland. It was quiet there, the kind of place where time seemed to move differently. The nurses were kind, their voices soft, their footsteps light on the linoleum floors. The window beside his bed overlooked a patch of evergreens, their branches bending slightly in the cold wind. Days passed in stillness. He kept Keanu's letter on his bedside table, folded neatly inside a small notebook. When nurses came to check on him, he'd sometimes open it and read those familiar words again. We all have chapters we wish we could rewrite. But what makes life beautiful is that we can still change the ending. Every time he read that line, it steadied him. One gray afternoon, he was dozing lightly when the door creaked open. A nurse peeked in with a gentle smile. "Mr. Hensley," she said softly, "you have a visitor." David blinked, confused. A visitor? Before he could ask who it was, a familiar voice came from the doorway. "Hey there, old friend." David turned his head, and his breath caught. Standing there, dressed simply in jeans and a dark coat, was Keanu Reeves. In his hand was a single white lily. David's eyes widened. "You again?" he said, his voice raspy, but light with disbelief. Keanu smiled warmly as he stepped inside. "Just checking on a friend." The nurse set down an extra chair and quietly slipped out, leaving them alone. Keanu sat beside the bed, setting the flower in a small glass of water on the nightstand. The room felt softer somehow, filled with something unspoken, but deeply human. David stared at him, shaking his head slightly. "You actually came all this way?" Keanu nodded. "I was in Oregon for a few days. I heard you weren't doing too well." David laughed weakly. "Guess news travels faster than it used to." Keanu smiled. Some news deserves to. They both fell quiet for a moment, the faint hum of hospital machines filling the silence. David looked down at his hands. Thin now, the veins visible beneath the skin. "I didn't expect to see you again," he said softly. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "I owed you another visit." David frowned. "Owed me? You forgave me, Keanu. I think that's more than enough." Keanu shook his head. "Forgiveness isn't a transaction, David. It's a connection. And I didn't want that to end with one conversation." David's throat tightened. "You're something else. You know that?" Keanu chuckled softly. "So I've been told." The two men smiled, and for a brief moment the sterile hospital room felt warm like a familiar cafe, like sunlight through a window. The afternoon drifted gently into evening. The light through the window turned gold, then slowly faded to a soft blue. The room felt peaceful, wrapped in that quiet stillness that hospitals often hold, the kind that makes small moments feel eternal. Keanu sat back in his chair, his hands folded, watching David rest between words. Every so often, David would glance over, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You really don't change much," he said softly. "Still calm, still patient." Keanu chuckled quietly. "Patience comes with practice." "Maybe that's what I needed more of," David murmured. "Patience. I spent most of my life rushing to say things I didn't mean." "You meant them then," Keanu said gently. "You were just a different person." David nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I was. But meeting you, it's funny, Keanu. You think forgiveness is about being forgiven, but it's more about learning to forgive yourself afterward." Keanu looked at him, thoughtful. "That's the hardest part." For a while they just sat together, listening to the faint sound of footsteps in the hall and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor by David's bed. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, whispering against the window pane. "I keep thinking about that day in the cafe," David said after a long pause. "You didn't say much. You just listened." "I think that's what changed me." Keanu smiled softly. "Listening is easy when you care." David gave a weak laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," Keanu said quietly. "It's just hard for most people to try." There was another silence, comfortable. This time, Keanu reached for the flower on the nightstand, adjusting it slightly in the glass. "White lilies," he said, almost to himself. "My sister used to love these." David looked at the flower, its petals glowing faintly in the dim light. "They're peaceful," he whispered. "You brought the right kind," Keanu smiled. Peace seemed fitting. The conversation wandered from there. Movies, books, places they both loved, people they missed. David talked about his old newsroom days, not with regret this time, but with fondness for the memories that hadn't hurt anyone. Keanu listened quietly, nodding, occasionally smiling at small details. As the clock approached 7, Keanu rose from his chair. "I should let you rest," he said softly. David looked up at him, his eyes glassy but bright. "You coming back to check on me again?" Keanu smiled warmly. "If you'll let me." David grinned faintly. "Only if you bring another flower." "I can do that," Keanu said. He hesitated, then added, "You gave me something too, David. A reminder that compassion still changes lives." "Even mine." David blinked, surprised. "Mine changed because of you." "Maybe that's the point," Keanu said quietly. "We changed together." He placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder, giving it a soft squeeze before stepping toward the door. David watched him go, the faint echo of footsteps fading down the hall. He looked once more at the lily on his bedside table, its white petals catching the soft light from the window. For the first time in months, he felt calm, not because he was healed, but because he was understood. The weeks that followed moved gently, as if time itself had learned to walk slower around David. The doctors spoke carefully now, their words tender but honest. His heart condition had worsened. The treatments helped little. Some mornings he woke with enough strength to write. Other days he simply watched the light shift across the wall, remembering. One afternoon, as a nurse adjusted his blanket, She asked softly, "Do you need anything else, Mr. Hensley?" David thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "A pen and some paper." She smiled, returned a few minutes later, and set a small notepad and pen on his bedside table. When she left, David sat upright and stared at the blank page for a long time. He didn't feel fear anymore, just a quiet urgency. There were still words left in him, words that mattered. He titled the page slowly, "Forgiveness saved my life." The words came gently, without effort. Each sentence felt like a heartbeat, slow, honest, final. He wrote about that cafe in Los Angeles, about the man who had once been a stranger but became a teacher. He described how forgiveness had changed him more than medicine ever could. "Doctors heal the body," he wrote, "but forgiveness heals the soul. And sometimes that's the only cure that matters." He didn't write as a journalist this time. He wrote as a human being, a man who had walked through shame and come out on the other side with open eyes. He admitted his arrogance, his pride, his cruelty, but instead of dwelling on regret, focused on grace. "We all have moments we wish we could erase," he wrote. "But life isn't about erasing, it's about rewriting. Forgiveness lets us hold the pen again." Every few minutes, he would pause, catching his breath, then continue, each word grounding him in peace. He wrote about Keanu, though he never used his full name. He called him a man who listens before he speaks and who chooses compassion over applause. Near the end, he wrote the line that had been echoing in his heart for days. "He didn't just forgive me. He reminded me that goodness still exists and that it's never too late to become someone new." When the article was finished, David sat back, his hands trembling from exhaustion, but his spirit calm. He knew this was his last piece, the one that would outlive him. He sealed a printed copy in an envelope and addressed it carefully to Keanu Reeves, writing in neat, deliberate letters. Then, on a separate piece of paper, he penned a short note. "You turned my worst mistake into my greatest lesson." He smiled faintly as he folded it and slipped it inside. The nurse later found him asleep, the envelope resting on the nightstand, ready to be mailed. When she offered to send it for him the next morning, David simply nodded, whispering, "Please make sure it reaches him." Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the hospital grounds in quiet white. David watched from the window, feeling a strange warmth beneath the chill. He didn't know how many days he had left, but he knew his words would go on. The letter was mailed the next morning. A nurse dropped it into the postbox on her way home, unaware of the quiet significance sealed inside. By the time the envelope reached Los Angeles a few days later, David's hospital room had grown still. He was weaker now, his voice softer, his thoughts wandering gently between memory and peace. He kept the notepad beside him, sometimes rereading the pages of "Forgiveness Saved My Life." Each time, his eyes lingered on that final line. It's never too late to become someone new. It wasn't just something he wrote, it was something he had lived. Late one evening, he whispered to a nurse, "I used to think being remembered meant being famous. Now I just want to be remembered as someone who learned." She smiled softly and adjusted his blanket. "I think you already are," she said. A few nights later, he closed his eyes and drifted into sleep. He didn't wake again. The nurses found him in the morning, his expression peaceful, his notepad resting open beside him. News of his passing reached quietly through the same circles that had once mocked his name. But this time, the tone was different. Writers, readers, and strangers across the world began sharing his article. It appeared on news sites, blogs, and social media feeds, not as gossip, but as grace. "Forgiveness Saved My Life" became a phenomenon, read aloud in classrooms, churches, and even therapy sessions. The simplicity of David's words struck a universal chord. He hadn't written about celebrity or redemption in the usual sense. He had written about what it means to be human, to fall, to learn, to forgive. A young journalist from London wrote, "David Hensley taught me more about storytelling in one article than any professor ever could. He taught me that truth matters more than cleverness." Another reader posted, "I've carried anger for years. After reading this, I decided to let it go." Within days, tributes poured in. News outlets revisited his story with compassion. Former critics of his old work called his final article a redemption arc, written not in ink, but in sincerity. And then, quietly, Keanu's name began appearing in the tributes not from him, but from others. Fans shared clips, quotes, and photos, each post echoing the same sentiment. This is why the world loves him. Keanu never issued a statement, never gave an interview. But a few weeks later, at a small charity gala in Beverly Hills, someone noticed a single white lily placed near the stage beside a folded note. The note contained just 3 words: "Thank you, David." No one knew who had left it. No one needed to. Back in Portland, the hospital staff framed David's handwritten article and hung it in the corridor near the chapel. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "In memory of David Hensley, proof that forgiveness can heal what time cannot." And so his story lived on, not in headlines or fame, but in the quiet hearts of those who read his final words and decided to forgive someone or themselves at last. Spring came early that year in Portland, though the sky still carried the melancholy weight of rain. The city was quiet, wrapped in a soft gray mist that blurred the trees and turned the streets into mirrors. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill, overlooking the river, a place of stillness and memory. Keanu Reeves walked slowly through the rows of headstones, the rain slicking his hair against his forehead. He wore a simple black coat and held a folded newspaper in one hand, a small bouquet of white lilies in the other. There were no cameras, no entourage, no security detail. Only him, the rain, and the soft hum of the wind weaving through the branches. He found the grave easily. The marker was modest, carved with quiet dignity. David Hensley, 1959, 2025. Forgiveness saved my life. Keanu stopped, staring at the inscription for a long time. The words carried more than memory, they carried truth. He crouched down, brushing away a few fallen petals from another bouquet that someone had left earlier. The soil was damp, the air cool and clean. He laid the lilies down gently beside the stone. Then he unfolded the newspaper, revealing a copy of the Portland Tribune, dated 3 months earlier. On the front page was David's final piece, "Forgiveness saved my life." The print was slightly smudged from the moisture in the air, but the headline was still clear. Keanu ran his thumb along the edge of the paper, then placed it carefully beside the flowers. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stood there, letting the rain soak into his coat, his breath visible in the chilled air. It had been months since David's passing, but Keanu had carried that letter, that memory, in the quiet corners of his mind. He remembered the hospital room, the frail man smiling through weakness, talking about life and mistakes and redemption. He remembered how gentle David's voice had been near the end, how grateful. "You were brave enough to apologize," Keanu whispered finally. "That's rare." His words were nearly lost in the rain, but the sentiment hung heavy in the air. He looked down at the grave again, his expression unreadable, part sorrow, part peace. He thought about how much the world had changed because of one man's courage to say, "I was wrong." Keanu didn't believe in grand gestures. He never had. But he believed in moments like this, quiet, private, meaningful. A man visiting another man's grave, not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as one soul paying respect to another who had finally found peace. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at his coat. He looked up toward the gray sky, blinking through the drizzle. "You did good, David," he murmured. "You finished well." He stayed there a while longer, standing in the rain, lost in thought. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang faintly, marking the hour. He took one last look at the headstone, then at the folded newspaper resting beside it. The bell's echo faded into the drizzle, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain against stone. Keanu crouched once more, tracing a hand gently along the carved words on David's headstone. The texture of the letters felt cold beneath his fingers, yet there was a strange warmth in them too, like the echo of a life finally made right. He whispered quietly, "You found peace, my friend." A crow called from a distant tree, its voice sharp against the soft rain. Keanu looked around for a moment at the vast field of markers stretching across the hill. Every one of them represented a story, some unfinished, some redeemed. David's was one of the rare ones that had turned from tragedy to grace before the final chapter closed. He thought about how easily the world forgets. People move on, stories fade, headlines disappear. But this story had lingered. It had lived in quiet hearts, in conversations between fathers and sons, in letters between strangers. Forgiveness, Keanu realized, never truly dies. It ripples forever. He knelt down, his coat brushing the damp grass. The lilies looked almost luminous against the gray stone. The newspaper, now damp and curling at the edges, fluttered slightly in the wind. Keanu placed a small stone over it to keep it from blowing away. He stayed like that for a long time, the rain washing over him. It wasn't sadness that filled him, it was gratitude. Gratitude that David had found his way back to kindness. Gratitude that he himself had been part of it. Gratitude that something as fragile as forgiveness could still survive in a world that often chose pride instead. Finally, he stood. His knees creaked slightly, and he smiled faintly at the sound. "Guess we're both getting older," he said quietly. "But maybe that's what it takes to understand things like this." He stepped back, taking one last look at the grave. The lilies glistened with raindrops, and the paper beneath them bore his reflection faintly in the wet ink. For a fleeting moment, it looked as if both their stories, his and David's, had merged there in that simple tribute. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked toward the river that wound beyond the cemetery. The mist over the water blurred everything into soft shades of silver. It reminded him of that cafe the day David had cried openly, unashamed, as strangers watched with quiet respect. That memory would stay with him forever. Keanu took a deep breath, his voice low and steady. "You taught me something too," he said. "Grace doesn't end with one person, it keeps going." Then he slipped his hands into his coat pockets and began walking down the narrow path toward the gate. The rain followed him, gentle and rhythmic, washing the footprints from the ground behind him. When he reached the road, he stopped once more and glanced back at the hill. From where he stood, David's resting place was just a small shape in the mist, almost invisible but not forgotten. Keanu's silhouette faded into the gray drizzle, leaving behind nothing but silence, lilies, and a folded newspaper beside a name carved in stone. A few months after David's passing, his family began receiving letters, hundreds of them. They came from all over the world: Manila, Toronto, Dublin, Seoul. Some were typed neatly, others handwritten in shaky ink. Each one carried a story, a confession, a thank you. The post office near their home even called one day to say the mailbox was overflowing. His daughter Emily began sorting them at the dining room table. She read them slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks as she went. Many of the letters came from people who had once followed her father's career in its early days. Some came from those who had only known him through his final article. One morning, she picked up a letter written on simple cream stationery. The handwriting was delicate and slightly uneven. She unfolded it carefully and began to read aloud to her mother, who sat across from her, eyes rimmed with quiet pride. "Dear Hensley family," it began. "Your father taught me something I'll never forget, that even the harshest words can end in peace. I was a teacher for 40 years. I've seen students hurt each other with words, and I've seen them heal each other with kindness. After reading your father's story, I decided to start every class with one simple reminder: speak gently. You never know who's listening. Thank you for sharing him with us." Emily's voice wavered as she reached the end. She folded the paper back slowly, her eyes wet. "He really changed people," she whispered. Her mother nodded softly. "He changed himself first. That's what made it real." Emily looked out the window at the fading light. The sky was pale gold, the kind of light her father used to love. She smiled faintly. "He would have laughed at this," she said. "He never thought anyone would forgive him. And now, he's helping strangers forgive each other." Over the following weeks, the family created a small memorial website where people could share their stories, The messages poured in faster than they could read them. Some were just a few words. He gave me hope. Others were long, heartfelt letters about reconciliation, healing, and second chances. One message stood out among the rest. It came from a university student majoring in journalism. She wrote, "I used to think success meant having the loudest voice. Your father showed me that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be kind." Emily printed that one and pinned it above her father's old desk, where his final notepad and pen still sat untouched. The desk became a kind of altar not to fame, but to forgiveness. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves was quietly working on something of his own. He had reached out to a few colleagues and university officials, determined to honor David's memory in a way that would live beyond any article or headline. He met with representatives from UCLA's journalism department. In a small, private meeting, he shared David's story, his mistakes, his growth, his redemption, and proposed a scholarship fund for young writers who would carry forward the lesson that words matter. When asked what the scholarship should stand for, Keanu's answer was simple: truth told with compassion. The faculty loved the idea immediately. Within months, the David Hensley Scholarship for Ethical Journalism was established at UCLA. It was funded quietly, without press releases or interviews. Keanu made sure it wasn't about publicity, but about purpose. The scholarship's mission was written in a single sentence that captured the spirit of everything David had come to represent: seek truth with kindness. During the dedication ceremony, a small group gathered in one of the campus gardens. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the trees, casting soft golden light over the marble plaque that had been placed beneath a flowering magnolia. A few professors spoke about integrity in writing. A former student shared how much David's final article had influenced her work. When it was Keanu's turn to speak, he stood in front of the plaque with his hands in his pockets, his voice quiet but steady. "Words can wound," he said, "but they can also heal." David learned that truth doesn't lose its power. When spoken with kindness, it gains it. I hope every writer who earns this scholarship remembers that. Then he paused, his gaze thoughtful. He was brave enough to face himself. That's where every great story begins. After his short speech, he knelt beside the plaque for a moment, his fingers brushing over the inscription. It read, "Words can wound, or they can heal. Choose wisely." He smiled faintly, recognizing the simplicity of the message. It sounded like something David himself might have written. Later, as the small crowd began to disperse, a young student lingered near the plaque. She turned to Keanu and said shyly, "I'm applying for the scholarship next year. I want to write stories that make people feel seen." Keanu smiled warmly. "Then you already understand what it's about." The student blushed and nodded, her eyes shining. As the sun dipped behind the campus buildings, Keanu took one last look at the magnolia tree swaying gently in the breeze. Petals drifted down, settling softly over the plaque. For a moment, the world felt still, like a quiet echo of the same peace he had felt that day at David's grave. He turned to leave, walking slowly across the courtyard as students passed by, laughing and talking about their classes, their futures, their dreams. It made him smile. Life was moving forward, as it always did, carrying pieces of the past with it, lessons, stories, and the invisible threads of kindness left behind by those who had learned the hard way how to forgive. Somewhere in Portland, Emily received a letter from UCLA weeks later, announcing the creation of the scholarship. Inside was a note signed simply, "In honor of your father's courage to change." She read it aloud at the dinner table, her voice trembling with pride. Her mother reached across and took her hand. "He'd be proud," she said softly. Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. "He'd probably just say, 'Be kind when you write.'" And together, they laughed the kind of laughter that carries love, memory, and peace all at once. It was a cool Los Angeles evening, a year to the week since the scholarship had been founded. The lights of the studio shimmered against the dark city skyline as Keanu Reeves took his seat across from the talk show host. The atmosphere was different from most interviews, quieter, gentler. The audience had already settled down, sensing that this wasn't going to be another round of film promotion or celebrity chatter. The host smiled warmly. "Keanu, you've always had this reputation for humility, for grace under pressure. People say you have this calm wisdom about you. Where does that come from?" Keanu leaned back slightly, smiling modestly. "From making mistakes," he said simply. The audience chuckled softly, but his tone stayed sincere. "I think we all learn by falling down a few times. It's what you do after that matters." The host nodded. "That's beautifully said. I want to ask about something that's touched a lot of people recently." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "A few years ago, there was a journalist who wrote about meeting you, someone who once criticized you and later sought your forgiveness. It became kind of a worldwide story. Would you be willing to talk about that night?" The studio grew quiet. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked down for a moment, his hands folded, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavy with meaning. "I remember him," he said softly. "David." He paused again, and the silence that followed was not awkward, it was reverent. He reached out after a long time. I think he'd been carrying a lot. I didn't know what I'd say when I saw him. I just knew that if someone asks for peace, you should meet them where they are. The host nodded, visibly moved. That's an incredible way to look at it. Keanu gave a small, reflective smile. Forgiveness isn't about pretending it never happened. It's about letting love be louder than pride. The audience fell completely silent. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching the sincerity in his eyes. The words hung in the air like a quiet prayer. Even the host seemed at a loss for a moment, his voice softer when he spoke again. "That's one of the most beautiful definitions I've ever heard," he said. Keanu shrugged gently. "I didn't plan it," he said with a faint smile. "It's just what I've learned. We can spend our lives collecting grudges, or we can choose to let them go. One makes us smaller, the other makes us free." The host leaned forward, his expression full of admiration. "You know, people talk about your movies, your career, all that, but this is what really touches people. It's who you are when no one's watching." Keanu smiled again, a little bashfully. "Who I am when no one's watching is just a man trying to do better than yesterday. That's all." The crowd erupted in quiet applause. It wasn't the usual loud cheer of a talk show audience. It was a slow, heartfelt clap that carried respect rather than excitement. As the applause faded, the host leaned in again. "Keanu, you said something once that really stuck with me, that pain can make people kind. Do you think that's what forgiveness is born from?" Keanu took a moment before answering. "Maybe," he said softly. "Pain can harden you, or it can open you. It depends on whether you want to build a wall or a bridge. David chose the bridge. That took courage." The audience listened intently. No one shifted in their seats. The studio, for that brief span of minutes, felt less like a talk show and more like a place of reflection. Keanu continued, his gaze calm but full of emotion. "When he came to me that day, I didn't see a man who hurt me. I saw a man who had hurt himself for a long time. And when someone is ready to heal, the least you can do is meet them with compassion." The host nodded slowly, visibly moved. "You know, it's rare to hear that kind of honesty in this industry." Keanu smiled faintly. "We all wear masks. Some just shine brighter under the lights. But what I learned from David is that the truth always finds its way through. It might take years, but it gets there." The host sat back, clearly touched. "If he could hear you now, what do you think you'd say to him?" Keanu looked toward the camera for a moment, his expression softening. "I'd say thank you. Thank you for reminding me that words can heal as much as they can hurt. And thank you for being brave enough to change." The silence that followed was deep and reverent. Even through the lens of millions watching at home, something real passed through that screen. Something raw, human, and profoundly kind. After a few moments, the host cleared his throat. "Keanu, I think that's one of the most powerful moments we've had on this show." Keanu smiled humbly. "Then maybe it was worth staying up for." The audience laughed gently, breaking the heaviness with warmth. The host smiled too. Before we wrap up, I just want to say this. There are people out there watching who've been holding grudges, carrying guilt, maybe for years, and they just heard you talk about forgiveness with such grace. What would you say to them? Keanu thought for a moment, his voice quiet but steady. I'd tell them it's never too late to start over. You can't rewrite the past, but you can change the way it ends. You can choose peace over pride. That choice, just that one choice, can change everything. The host placed a hand over his heart, nodding. That's powerful. When the show ended, the clip went viral overnight. Millions watched that single moment. The pause, the sincerity, the words that lingered like music. Forgiveness isn't about pretending it never happened. It's about letting love be louder than pride. It became more than a quote. It became a lesson shared, reposted, printed, and remembered. And through it all, the world didn't just see a movie star that night. They saw a man who had lived grace, carried it, and passed it on. The story comes full circle, with quiet simplicity. The screen fades from black to a soft, cinematic shot of the same cafe where everything began. The little corner table, where David once sat trembling, waiting for forgiveness he never thought he'd receive. The morning light filters gently through the window, and the chair across from his old seat is empty now. Yet the space feels alive with memory. The hum of the espresso machine, the faint clinking of cups, the sound of rain against the glass, it all feels timeless, as if kindness itself has left a trace in the air. Keanu is seen walking past that same cafe. Now, years later, he pauses for a moment outside, his reflection faint in the glass. For just a second, he looks at the table through the window, then gives a small smile, the kind that speaks not of sadness, but gratitude. Then he walks away into the morning, his silhouette framed by the light breaking through the clouds. The next image fades in, a shot of David's framed article hanging in a hallway. The title, "Forgiveness Saved My Life," gleams faintly under the glass. Beneath it, a small note is engraved on a plaque, donated by Keanu Reeves in memory of David Hensley, proof that grace can outlive us all. The camera lingers there for a few seconds, then transitions to a new scene, the courtyard of UCLA, where students gather beneath the magnolia tree planted beside the journalism scholarship plaque. A young student, notebook in hand, kneels to read the inscription aloud. Words can wound, or they can heal. Choose wisely. She whispers the words again, almost reverently, before smiling and walking off toward her next class. Around her, other students laugh, talk, share coffee, and dream. The camera pans upward, showing the branches swaying gently in the breeze. Sunlight filters through the leaves, scattering gold across the courtyard. The voiceover begins softly, blending with gentle piano music in the background. One act of forgiveness can rewrite decades of regret. Images flash slowly across the screen, like memories David smiling weakly in his hospital bed as he writes his final words. Keanu, leaving the white lily on his grave. Emily reading a letter from a stranger who found peace because of her father's story. Each image fades seamlessly into the next, like ripples moving outward across still water. The voiceover continues. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't pretend the pain wasn't real, but it changes what comes next. It transforms the ending. The piano grows slightly fuller, a soft crescendo beneath the narration. We live in a world quick to judge, quick to divide, quick to shout. But sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply to listen, to meet pain with understanding, to let love be louder than pride. The camera returns to Keanu, walking along a quiet city street. The rain has stopped now, and the sun peeks through, illuminating the wet pavement. He carries nothing, says nothing. His calm presence speaks enough. The voiceover pauses for a heartbeat, allowing the emotion to settle before the reflection continues. The screen softens again, fading to a view of the same park bench where David once sat in his final days. The wind moves through the trees, scattering petals across the path. The white lily Keanu had left is gone now, but a few wildflowers bloom nearby. Nature, as always, carries on quietly renewing, forgiving, without words. The voiceover returns, calm and steady. Forgiveness is not weakness, it's strength in its purest form. It asks us to release anger before it poisons the heart, to reach out when it would be easier to turn away, and to see humanity in the faces of those who once hurt us. Images play one after another. Keanu, sitting in that cafe years earlier, David's trembling hands reaching across the table, the moment of quiet understanding between them. Then, a fade to the journalist's framed note that reads, "You turned my worst mistake into my greatest lesson." The voiceover continues. We cannot change what has been written in the past, but we can decide what the final paragraph will say. Forgiveness doesn't erase the story, it gives it meaning. The piano melody swells slightly, carrying emotion without overpowering it. Keanu appears once more, standing on a small bridge overlooking the city at dusk. The lights shimmer below him like reflections of every life his story touched. His expression is calm, but there's depth in his gaze, a quiet peace that comes from living what others only speak about. The voiceover lowers to a whisper. Forgiveness saves more than one life. It saves every heart it touches. Then, slowly, the screen transitions to soft black. The text fades in, centered against the darkness. Reflection prompt. Have you ever been forgiven for something you regretted deeply? How did it change you? The words linger for a moment, allowing viewers to think, to feel, to reflect. Then the music shifts gently as new text appears, warm and inviting. Viewer invitation. Tell us in the comments which act of forgiveness in your life meant the most and what lesson you took from it. As the words fade, the piano melody continues under one final sequence, a slow montage, the cafe's lights turning off for the night, the framed article catching a faint reflection of morning Sunday, the magnolia tree swaying on campus, the plaque glistening softly in the evening rain. Then, one last shot of Keanu walking alone down a quiet street, his figure fading into the glow of the city. The music tapers to silence, and the final line appears on screen in gentle white text. Forgiveness doesn't make us forget. It reminds us who we can still become. After a beat of silence, the screen fades completely to black. The outro music begins slow, emotional, reflective. The viewer is left not with sadness, but with hope. Hope that kindness, humility, and grace still exist in a world that too often forgets them. The final voiceover returns for just a moment, soft as a breath. One act of forgiveness can change the world, starting with yours.